Hello and welcome to the second episode of the new era of Bingley Talks Politics, and it's again with me, Mr. Booth, my erstwhile colleague, Mr. Cook.
Hello.
And today we have hopefully the first of many appearances, already a star Year 12 student. It's Finn.
Hello.
So it's three of us today, so we're branching out, but we're excited about this, aren't we? And we've got quite a few topics today. Great that many people have listened. I've had loads of people saying, "Oh, we listened in for a bit," or "We listened to the whole thing. It's, really enjoyed it." That sort of thing. That's great. If anyone has any questions or anything that you want us to discuss, or you want to pick up on something you agree, or hopefully disagree maybe with something we've mentioned, please let us know, because we would like to mention some questions, issues, things that you may have. Okay, right. So today, we need to know our difference, are you ready, between our right and left. Right wing, left wing. This gets mentioned, bandied about loads of times, doesn't it? Right wing, left wing. Yeah. I was just reading something yesterday, I think it was, and it was about the government's recent policy announcements, and that term was mentioned at least 2 or 3 times. People have mentioned it to me. It might be a term that is not always the most useful or informative, but we still have it, don't we? So I'll start with, what does it mean to be right-wing, to be left-wing? Mr. Cook, have you got any?
Yeah.
Where do we start with this one?
Well, I personally don't find it too helpful these days, left-right wing. Although I get that it's like political shorthand, basically, for a lot of policy formulations. So, it's easier to say Liz Truss's package is left or right-wing, and to get that across to people, to explain it in very simple terms, and it is to go well, this policy is technically here on the economic spectrum, and this one's here on the social spectrum. But I think the issue with left, right wing is when you start trying to classify members of the electorate. That's when you get into difficulties sometimes, because they can hold contradictory opinions if you look at it through the left-right axis.
I tell you what, there's that electoral calculus thing online. And it has all of the different, I don't know if you've seen it, all of the different axes. So they've got 3 different axes. I don't know if that's right, plural, axes, or anyway. But it's all sort of a 3D, I don't know, it's strange.
I know what you're getting
but it's sort of quite good.
Is this the one that then throws in the word, you can be right authoritarian, or am I thinking of the same thing? Or is that the compass
sort of
one?
It's like, I don't know, you can be like Mr. and Mrs. Centrist. It categorises the population, are you a progressive or are you quite strong right?
So it's a bit more specific, it's a bit more...
Yeah, it's more dynamic, basically.
So, I get the point about labelling, it's a little bit unhelpful, but it's clear.
It's clear.
And people understand left and right. And
you can also apply it spatially. So Italy, France, Britain, America, it's shorthand that you can use in any of these political contexts without having to necessarily understand the institutions themselves that make up that country's system.
And when I often mention this in lessons, which I am apt to do, obviously, like talking about it, I like to use the horseshoe analogy.
Yes.
Rather than a sort of straight line and left and right being, a long way away from each other. You might find if you are towards the end of the left and right spectrum, you've actually got a little bit more in common than you might realise. But again, that's up for debate, and how applicable it is. Remember, Tony Blair said he didn't like it. He preferred, there's a right and there's a wrong, rather than a right and left. But let's run with it for a few minutes. So, if you are right wing, or if something is right wing, what does that mean?
It's more generally more conservative, so I don't know, you might not agree with things like abortion, or you might not agree you should have more women's rights. And then economically, it's more low taxes, lower spending, a freer market. That's sort of like the basic.
Yeah, so some big hitters there, aren't there? Low taxes, right wing. Free markets, right wing. It does mix sometimes with those. The first thing is some more traditional social values, right wing. So that mix. But then again, as you said a few minutes ago, Mr. Cook, that doesn't always... You don't have to tick every box there, perhaps, do you? You might not tick every box.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when you start applying it to case studies is when... I always get it with the Conservative Party and the nature of the Conservative Party. My dad will say, and I get where it comes from, whenever the Tories are in power, policing's bad and healthcare's bad and education's bad, but that's a very recent phenomenon, that Tory party. That's post-Thatcher. You look at the pre-Thatcher Conservative Party and it becomes near impossible to label them left or right-wing, because a lot of social issues, they are conservative, and a lot of the economic issues, the Tories back then were pretty much consolidationist. Right?
So you've got to remember that, haven't you, and be on the lookout for where it might, I suppose, contradict.
But then someone like Trump seems to fit into the right-wing column too perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's where it comes, that's where the utility comes in. Although
would, a bit like Boris Johnson, go for huge state spending at the drop of a hat, perhaps?
Maybe, right? I think Trump's a tactician rather than a idea.
Perhaps, yeah. I think he supported the Democrats about 30 years ago, didn't he?
Well, the idea that he's not pro-choice is hilarious, Trump, because he's got to be.
Yeah.
So, I tell you what, let's leave Mr. Trump out of today.
Yes.
We'll make an informal pact, because we don't need him today. We'll do him at some other time, if and when. But I'm going to say thank you to the government, because they listened to us. They listened to us last week, because I think we mentioned that we didn't find some of their initial announcements, the new era, Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, very conservative. But they've come out and they've said, well, we'll prove you wrong. Here's a conservative policy. And so what I mean by that is they did the budget, although it's a mini budget, although it sounded quite a decent budget, where they are going to lower tax, like you said, Finn, about that's a right-wing policy. Low tax, and he's doing a big tax cut, the biggest tax cuts for 50 years, right-wing. So people are using that term a lot, aren't they? This is a right-wing policy. I suppose we can run with that.
Yeah.
Let's go to the other side for a minute. So to be a left-winger, Finn, is?
Well, it's basically opposite. High tax economically, high taxes, high spending. You know, parties like the Labour Party traditionally advocated that public services like your rail, energy, water, they should be in the hands of the state.
Potentially, yeah.
And not private hands. And then socially, you think, well, the Labour Party's always been very progressive on, gay rights, women's rights. It's always been, more progressive.
Race Relations, First Race Relations Act, Labour Party, yeah.
Yeah, so that's,
It's a good summary, isn't it, of the left. I think what we could do with is, why do they believe that? What sort of values, ideas underpin the left? And what values, ideas underpin the right? Has anyone got any ideas on that? So if we just stick with the left, you said high state spending, which might mean high taxes. Why did they do that? Why do left-wing parties, or why did they champion that idea?
I was reading something about an introduction to socialism, and obviously, the political axis. It's so diverse, full of so many different ideologies. But he said the only thing that that the left wing and socialism can really agree on is that equality is a good thing, and we should go towards equality. That's sort of the founding principle, really, of the left wing.
Yeah, I reckon.
Argue.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the first about the Fabian Society, right? Back in the early 1900s,
yes.
right? That's what we're talking about. That was kind of the beginning of that movement in Britain. And yeah, the impact on the Labour Party ever since has been there, right? It's been present. I think partly is it a response to interest groups, though? Is it rather the left's coalition tends to be a coalition of minorities, right? And the demands from there come for the high taxing, high welfare spending, more regulations on business, quite rightly in some cases. Whereas the Conservatives, arguably, their electorate tends to be middle-class voters who, times get hard, maybe want to claw back some of their own income. I think that it's the different factors you've got on the parties, right? You've got the ideologies, you've got the interest groups, you've got the own internal factions within those parties.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
But we're trying to give us a few relatively straightforward things. We said at the start, left-wing, right-wing doesn't always work, it's not always helpful. But if we say left-wing kind of prioritises equality, what's happening over on the right? What are they prioritising?
Well, there's individualism, right? Is that tends to be how people frame it, isn't it? Individualism versus collectivism, kind of. Do you allow people to prioritise themselves and their own units, or is there a wider obligation towards the country, humanity, right? It depends how far you want to take it.
sorry. I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, collective individualism. I normally see that as the traditional right-wing belief, libertarianism, and that type of thing. When you go to like things like Trump, it's very much us and them, and I see that more as a collectivist policy.
Absolutely,
almost.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd see that as where populism is coming in
Yeah.
as well, the us and them, because that's almost a rejection of pluralism. But we digress a little bit. So we've got individual freedom on the right. I think at this stage, I'll just caveat this. We're not really bringing in those far-right people yet, or indeed the far left, because they tend to do things a little bit differently both ways, don't they?
Yeah.
So generally, right-wing, you've got individual freedom. We believe in that as perhaps the most important thing, contrasting with equality on the other side. So here's an interesting question. One at a time, please. Can you have both? I mean, we said about prioritising. So would a left-winger, could you not like individual freedom, and could a right-winger not like equality? How do they sit, complement each other? That's a good question, isn't it?
Well, it's a confusing one, really, because when you look at ideologies like fascism, it's very much like, well, it was National Socialism, wasn't it? It was very, very right-wing socially, but then you have sort of like economically socialist elements in there. When you look at communism, it's sort of like it's obviously very collectivist. We think of communists traditionally as being very collectivist, but then you go to anarchists, they're also very, very far left, and they're individualists. So it's always sort of like a bunch and a mix of different things, really. I don't know.
Something that you always mention to me, libertarian socialism, right?
Yeah,
right.
Here we go.
Right.
Yeah.
That in itself, as you just said, Finn, right, it encompasses. I think the other example you could bring up is people like we've already said, we won't mention the T word again. Boris, I guess. It was hard to categorise him at first because you had Brexit, very anti-immigration and stuff, very collectivist, but then he'd ramble on about tax cuts, he'd ramble on about all this other stuff, and it's almost, can you have a right-wing individualism, a right-wing collectivism, and also on the other side, as you both said, a left-wing?
Again, complicating it, developing a bit of a pick-and-mix policy approach. And then you think, well, does that work? I mean, are they grouped together for a reason? Because they sort of fit together. If you look at certain governments or certain sets of ideas, they complement each other. They work together, state spending, equality, giving access to more services, the NHS. They're all the same, sort of similar bedfellows, aren't they? Same on the right. I think it's just quite an interesting area. And yes, I think it's one where sometimes I would argue it hasn't helped parties or people who support political parties. They go down little blind alleys sometimes by thinking almost like trying to shoehorn things that must be left-wing. It's like, well, hang on, you can recognise individualism within a left-wing framework. And if you want actually to argue this out, you look at the first libertarians. Libertarianism has been manipulated, if you like, and become, and now, quite a fairly radical right ideology, but it didn't start like that. And so you've always got to maybe check yourself and think, well, hang on a minute, I don't need to reject the idea of individual freedom if I like these other things too. But then there's that question mark about whether that's an incoherent approach. Look, there's loads of issues here, aren't there? But it's fair to say these labels are still in use, and we could do with understanding what's going on. And let's move this on then, how they might be affecting or being played out in politics today. We're going to go abroad, aren't we, for a little bit, and we're going to look at two sets of elections that have happened in Europe recently, what they might tell us. We might then bring it back to general or even British, UK type issues and what that means for us. But first of all, we're going to Scandinavia, aren't we? And we want to talk about Sweden. Finn, you want to talk about Sweden. You were quite enthusiastic about this. So what's happened in Sweden recently? What's going on? Why is it important? Tell us, Finn.
Yeah. So Sweden's just, if you ever want to get into like a sort of, if you ever want to get into politics or look at politics abroad, Sweden's a brilliant one to go to because it's fairly simple and also stuff's happening literally all the time. So what's happened in the last elections was that it was expected that the Socialist Party, the Social Democrat Party, which is left-wing, high taxes, all of that stuff, it was expected that they were going to win the election, and they did gain more seats. However, they've been ousted out of government. And on the other hand, the traditional centre-right bloc, that wasn't expected to get into government. They've lost seats. They've had the worst election result ever, but they've still gotten into government. And that's basically because recently the centre-right bloc has invited in, centre-right meaning, like lower taxes, very, very much like similar to the Conservative Party. They've invited in the far-right bloc, because normally what happened in Swedish politics was that you have the left-wing bloc, which composed the Social Democratic Party, very similar to the Labour Party, and the right-wing bloc. Now, in elections, either one would get a majority. It's pretty simple, either left-wing or right.
And voters kind of knew that, didn't they? That's the bloc politics working, isn't it? If I vote for maybe a little left-wing party, I kind of know that might be for a bigger left-wing bloc.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can still express maybe there were other parties, weren't there? But they were sitting within blocks, and the choice was relatively straightforward in that. And that was very much a left-right type dynamic going on there.
Exactly. And so recently, and this has happened in several other Scandinavian countries in recent years, you've gotten the rise of the far-right parties. Now in Sweden, this is for the Sweden Democrats. They're very anti-Islam, very Islamophobic, very anti-immigration. They've got their roots in sympathising with fascist, Nazi, neo-Nazis, all of that. But they've been gaining seats quite rapidly in recent years. Now that sort of posed a conundrum for the swing of bloc politics, because basically you get this far-right party, and then the right-wing bloc is like, well, should we cooperate with them? Because their leader is associated with Nazis. Should we allow that in? Obviously, Nazis, you think, oh God, Holocaust, Hitler, that's all a very bad reputation. And how the Nazis originally got in power was through cooperation with the right wing. And so there was a conundrum over whether or not you let the right wing in. And in 2020, they did, to much anger in Swedish politics. And here we are.
Yeah, it's seen as a bit of a pivotal moment because it's developed a reputation, hasn't it, for that welfare social democrat. They've been the dominant force, dominant party, haven't they? And everyone looks to Scandinavia, Sweden in particular, as that's how they do things there. But perhaps it is changing. Quite interestingly, I found out that the National Party, they quite popular in the southern parts of Sweden, where you might see higher levels of immigration, which is something that far right momentum does. It splits countries, doesn't it? We've talked a lot about far right. We've done things in school about far right. I've done assemblies about the far right. The far right isn't just one group either, though, is it? Now, what have the Sweden version of the far right, the Swedish version of the far right, the National Party, what have they done to become more electable? What do far right parties do to become more electable? Because generally they still usually, even if they might be popular for a bit, they still have generally polled lower votes. But in recent times, their votes are going up, aren't they? How come? I mean, we've said anti-immigration. Well, what else do you think's going on?
I mean, I'm a layman here on Sweden. I'll defer to Finn mostly. But what I'm aware, there's been a change of emphasis, hasn't there? So Sweden's suffering from inflation, cost of living crisis. I don't think as severely as Britain is, but they're still ticking up, right? But the entire election seemed to have been defined. Gun crime was a big thing, right? Yeah. There was a case where a woman and her son got shot in a park or something a few weeks before the election came around. And it seems like they're really successful, the Sweden Democrats, set the narrative, set the agenda in debates and stuff. But then again, I'll defer to you, because I honestly don't know much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, generally, what's been happening with nationalist parties over the past few years, this has happened in France, it's happened in Germany, it's happening in Italy right now, is that the far-right parties undergo a liberalisation of their policy. So it's not as radical. So before, they would be the Sweden Democrats. They've come from a Nazi point, very, very strongly Nazi in the 1980s. But that's sort of gone away now, and they've tried to distance themselves from it. Instead of being we don't want any immigrants coming into our country. We hate all aspects of Islam. It's been like, we just want to significantly reduce the amount of immigrants, and we don't really like Islam, but we're not going to eradicate it. And this liberalisation, it makes it more palatable to a mass audience.
And I think what they do successfully is, and this is whether they focus on key issues, the more mainstream issues, crime, the economy. Far-right parties do well when there's economic crisis. I don't think I'm saying anything particularly controversial there. History tends to suggest that's what happens. And when economic crises happen, crime might go up, or that might be linked to immigrants. And whether that's accurate or not, far-right parties can get mileage out of that. Now, that particular incident, it might be symbolic of a wider crime wave or not, but they can use that, can't they, to really sort of hammer that point home and really use that. And voters will react to that. Remember, most voters react to relatively simple signals and messages. And so, they've rebranded, haven't they? I mean, Le Pen in France has rebranded. In Italy, Meloni rebranded, and we'll come to Italy in a minute or two. And definitely Sweden has rebranded. Is it Åkesson? Am I getting the... he's the lead, Jimmy Åkesson. So still quite young as well. Yeah, and that might be an interesting thing. The far right, a new era of the far right, and they perhaps are more electable, younger faces, sort of a fresher image. Yeah, it does matter, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
However, let's caveat this, and this is a similarity between, and we can compare to Italy now. Both far right parties, and what we're talking about is the Brothers of Italy in particular. Now, that's a slightly different coalition, isn't it? Because it's going to be a coalition, we think, with the Brothers of Italy, Salvini's League, and the Forza Berlusconi's party, all relatively right-wing. And but they actually, Brothers of Italy, Nationalists in Sweden, just in the 20% of the vote. Roughly about a quarter of people vote for them. Yeah. And then why are they then becoming the dominant force? What's happening here?
It's PR partly, right? They have the what's the word? The weight. They have the reason they're so important is because they have to rely on the right for more seats to get into power as a bloc, as you said, Finn. Right? It's this bloc system that you've got, and I guess it makes room for these very, very radical parties to essentially have some influence over wider policy.
So it's the electoral system, isn't it, to a degree?
It is.
It does help. Certain systems can have really strong advantages. Often they have, at the same time, other things that you might not like, and that can be included, letting radical parties in. The first past the post British system traditionally doesn't really... it's difficult for a radical party to enter the House of Commons, isn't it?
Well, UKIP, 2015, third most amount of votes. I think they got one seat. Right? And they were quite a radical party back then. They were the ones arguing for leaving the EU straight without a referendum and stuff. And, whether you like it or not, first past the post kept them out, essentially, for having much influence in that parliament.
However, then people will throw it back and say, well, that's not democratic, is it?
Yeah.
Expression of people's votes. So, politics, guys, isn't it? It really is. It's interesting, but it throws up all these things that we really need to be aware of. Okay, so, let's just go to Italy. We've done good section on Sweden there. What's happening in Italy? Are we talking fascism in Italy? Is it coming back? What do we think there?
That's what Finn said, right? They've gone through this liberalisation process. These fraternity d'Italia. My Italian's not good, so that's probably completely bullshit it. But so usually they've liberalised themselves, haven't they? Yeah. So they've gone from a party with roots to, I can't remember the name of the party. After 1945, at the end of the war, there was a Mussolini kind of fanboy.
Oh, it was
party.
MSI.
There we go, right? And they've got links to them, don't they, I think? Which they've tried to... Yeah. But then you've got parts of... I watched an interview with a southern Italian woman, can't remember which town it was in, where she had a Mussolini gift shop.
Yeah, I think Mussolini's quite an interesting one in Italy, and this is purely anecdotal. I've spoken to a few people about it, but it's got an interesting reputation, I think, depending on where you are and what you're talking about. My colleague, Mr. Burniston, likes to use the statement, the trains run on time. The trains run on time, which is a sense of things get done, and sometimes people just prefer things to get done. And it might be nostalgia creeping in here, it might be a few things creeping in here, but they might look back on an era that when things worked. Far-right parties are brilliant at using nostalgia and emotion.
Exactly. I think, especially with Meloni, she's definitely capitalised on Mussolini, because in Italy, the way that I perceive things is that there really hasn't been a reckoning with Mussolini as much as in Germany there's been a reckoning with Hitler. They know their history, whereas I don't think in Italy it's sort of they know how dangerous it was. Berlusconi, who was been the longest Prime Minister of Italy on several occasions, incredibly interesting character, said that something along the lines of, Mussolini didn't send political prisoners away to concentration camps, he just sent them on holiday. But he sent them to concentration camps, and it's really weird. He was still elected after that. He still managed to, be the most corrupt man in Europe, have his interesting parties. But, I just don't think Italy has really reconciled.
Yeah, that's an interesting one on the reckoning. I think another thing we need to take account of, really low turnout. I don't know what the percentage is in Italy, but I don't know. It might be different in Sweden. My hunch is more Swedes vote, although it might have dropped off.
I think so, yeah.
However, Italy, it's a low turnout for an election, and that's another thing to be aware of. So clearly, what's happening is a reaction to the system in general, frustration. People aren't happy with just way things are going, and it's almost like a protest. I'm going to protest by not voting. However, a partial consequence of that is some more radical parties have then looked like they're going to be able to form a government. Now, this government might not last long. Italian governments haven't got a great reputation for longevity, particularly when they're having to sort of power share and stitch together a coalition. Salvini's got a bit of a reputation for quickly changing his mind and bringing down coalitions. Draghi still seems, with quite a few people, quite popular, the last Prime Minister, but obviously has stepped down. So, look, every country does have a different politics, but there are certain sort of themes here. Do we see a similar thing happening? If we bring it back for the last few minutes to Britain, do we see a similar type thing happening? Is it feasible that it's going to be like Sweden or Italy, or are we just going to be different?
I think Britain it says a lot that, Oswald Mosley was like the most we got to fascism, really, and even he didn't really take off. People thought it was pretty ridiculous, marching down Trafalgar Square with, what they're called, turtlenecks on.
Yeah.
I think it's partly first past the post, but I don't think you can give all the credit to it. I think it is also, we muddle along, don't we? It's
our great strength.
Stability at any cost.
So instinctively, perhaps against the...
Yeah, I think also we've got a fairly well-functioning system. Sometimes people get in that you don't like. I mean, often people get in that you don't like. But at the end of the day, you don't have like Brazilian-esque corruption or people being actually coming out and saying they want incredibly Islamophobic policies or anything. Even UKIP's had to.
However, always got to be on your guard, haven't you?
Yeah.
It's very important that. I mean, you certainly weren't implying complacency there, but it can breed complacency that, this is Britain, it won't happen here. One of my many maxims, 3 steps from a dictatorship. We're only 3 steps from a dictatorship. It's more of a suggestion. However, it does have something in it, doesn't it? It doesn't take much for any country potentially to turn. And it's just something that I think people need to be aware of.
And the economic crises, like you said, is something that's just a constant trend throughout history. Also, like inflated grain prices. You look at not comparing it to fascism with the fire, but you look at the revolutions in the 1800s throughout Europe. That was all on the back of really high grain prices, and that brought down the establishment.
They can have unforeseen consequences, can't they? So you've always got to be aware of that.
And there's also the thing like in Weimar Germany as well. Governments constantly collapsing, and because of the political system. In Italy, they've had 70 prime ministers in 70 years. There's no more unstable place in Italy. So people generally, what you hear from people in Italy is people saying, "I'm absolutely fed up with politics. I want something new." The simple answer is the far right. It's Fratelli d'Italia. It's Giorgia Meloni. It's a really easy answer to a complex question. That's always the far right.
And I suppose in 6 months, a year's time, we'll have to see how they've got on.
There'll be another Prime Minister by then. Full stop.
If I was a betting man, that would where my money would go.
So, you know, we've discussed quite a few topics there. We've done quite a lot there, hasn't it? It's
Yeah,
quite a good
that was
effort
a
today.
episode.
So I think if anyone's got any questions or things they want to raise on the issue of right wing, left wing, we talked about that, including the far right. We haven't really talked about the far left. Future episode, I think, maybe on far left groups, what's happening there. European politics in general, there's lots we haven't touched on, which we'll come back to, but certainly Sweden and Italy are interesting at the moment, and how far that overlaps with us in the UK or not. And just things to keep an eye on. I've had some great suggestions from a Year 10 student about future episodes. So any questions anyone's got, please send them in, and we will be doing another episode next week.
Absolutely.
Yes?
Yes.
Right.
Brilliant.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for Finn.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to everyone, and we'll see you next week.